You think a cheap cardigan makes you invisible. You don't belong here. People like you we walk over. The cruel voices echoed through the marble halls, sharp as broken glass, as laughter filled the air and humiliation dripped from every glance. But what happens when the woman they mock, the woman they try to crush, carries a storm within her? What happens when quiet dignity becomes the force that topples empires? This is not just another story about injustice. It's a story about resilience, about standing tall when the world tries to tear you down, about fighting back, not with anger, but with unbreakable pride. Welcome to StoryFlow, where stories aren't just told, they're felt. Subscribe, listen, and witness the kind of strength that changes everything. The early afternoon light filtered through the vast glass windows of Titan Financial Group, casting long, sterile beams across the meticulously polished marble floor. Amara Johnson sat tucked away in the far corner of the 42nd floor, her small cubicle barely enough to hold her modest desk, her second-hand laptop, and a worn navy tote bag that slumped quietly by her side. She wore her usual simple navy cardigan, a white blouse neatly pressed beneath, and sensible loafers whose edges bore the scuff marks of long walks and longer dreams. Around her buzzed a world she never truly belonged to, a world painted in tailored suits, sparkling watches, and casual cruelty wrapped in designer perfume. The clicking of keyboards and the hum of financial jargon barely masked the undercurrent of disdain that always seemed to thicken when Amara entered the room. Today, however, that disdain would no longer hide beneath polite veneers. Sabrina Lewis, the crown jewel of superficial success, approached with her trademark sway, her golden hair bouncing with each calculated step. A Starbucks iced caramel latte clutched lazily in one perfectly manicured hand. She paused just a moment beside Amara's desk, long enough for a sickly sweet smile to curl the corners of her mouth, and with a flick so casual it could almost be mistaken for an accident, she tilted her cup. A torrent of sticky, freezing coffee exploded across Amara's chest, soaking her blouse, her old cardigan, splattering her laptop, and drenching the weekly reports she had spent hours preparing. For one suspended moment, time itself seemed to gasp. Then came the laughter, sharp, loud, a brutal applause for cruelty well played. Blake Turner, his gelled hair shining under the sterile lights, sauntered over, a grin splitting his face. Without hesitation, he lashed out with his foot, kicking the leg of Amara's chair so hard it buckled. She pitched forward, barely catching herself against the edge of the desk, her thin fingers grasping desperately for balance as her chair clattered noisily to the ground. Vanessa Chu, perched nearby like a vulture sensing blood, whipped out her phone, angling it gleefully toward Amara's soaked, trembling form. "This is gold," she giggled breathlessly, her fingers already dancing to capture the scene for the world to devour. And the world around them, the so-called professionals of Titan Financial, did nothing. No hand reached out to help. No voice rose in protest. Instead, they watched, amused, entertained, complicit. Faces turned slightly to one another with smirks. Whispers bloomed like toxic flowers in the charged air. Amara stood there, dripping, her breath shallow, her heartbeat loud in her ears. Her skin burning, not from the cold liquid, but from the white-hot sting of humiliation. Her honey-brown skin seemed to shimmer under the fluorescent lights, every drop of coffee clinging to her cardigan like badges of shame pinned by cruel, invisible hands. She lowered her gaze, fighting the tears clawing at the edges of her vision, and bent down silently to retrieve the soaked papers, each movement slow, mechanical, as though she feared breaking what little was left of her dignity. In the distance, Richard Hale, the regional manager, leaned casually against the frosted glass wall of his office, arms crossed, a small, approving smirk pulling at his mouth. To him, and to them, Amara was nothing more than a minor inconvenience in an otherwise perfect, pristine world. But in that moment, as the cold seeped into her skin, Amara Johnson made a silent vow deep within herself, a vow they would all soon regret forcing her to make. For the storm was already gathering, dark and relentless. And when it broke, no amount of Prada or privilege would save them. The laughter eventually faded, but the echoes of it lingered, vibrating in Amara Johnson's bones like an unwanted melody she couldn't silence. Her soaked clothes clung heavily to her skin, each droplet a cruel reminder that she was an outsider in this kingdom of hollow kings and queens. She knelt wordlessly, fingers trembling as she gathered the ruined papers from the cold marble floor. the edges curling and tearing under her touch. Every small movement, every rustling page, felt like an announcement of her humiliation to the silent spectators standing by. As she rose slowly to her feet, the stench of the sugary coffee mingled with the sterile scent of the office, surrounding her in a suffocating cloud. She dared to glance up for a fleeting second and saw nothing but a wall of cold eyes, eyes that judged, that mocked, that pitied in the most patronizing way. In the far corner, Blake Turner leaned casually against a cubicle divider, whispering something to Vanessa Chu, who stifled her laughter behind perfectly manicured hands. Further down the aisle, Sabrina Lewis smirked openly, her arms crossed in gleeful satisfaction, savoring the sight of the damage she had wrought. No one, not a single soul, extended even a handkerchief, a kind word, a hint of humanity, and high above them all, behind the frosted glass of his private office, Richard Hale watched with the cool detachment of a man surveying the inevitable fall of someone he had never considered worthy of standing among them. Amara inhaled deeply, willing her knees not to buckle, willing herself to remain standing. The marble floor beneath her feet felt slick and treacherous, not just from the spill, but from the sudden realization that she was utterly, chillingly alone. Her heart thudded painfully against her ribs, the pressure building behind her eyes. But she forced back the tears with a discipline born of too many battles fought in silence. They wanted a spectacle. They wanted to see her crumble, to confirm the story they had already written about her, the poor, foolish woman who didn't know her place. But Amara refused to give them the satisfaction. She straightened her shoulders, clutching the ruined reports tightly to her chest like a shield. Her cardigan, now heavy and stained, hung from her body like the tattered banner of a fallen soldier. And yet, deep inside the wreckage of that moment, something stirred, a flicker of something fierce and unyielding. They had wounded her. Oh, they had wounded her deeply. But they had not destroyed her. Not yet. Not ever. The clock on the wall ticked mercilessly loudly in the hollow silence. Somewhere, someone coughed nervously. The world spun on, indifferent, and Amara, soaked, broken, but still standing, turned back to her desk with mechanical grace. Her every step echoing the silent promise that this would not be the end of her story. No, this was only the beginning. Amara sat back down at her desk, the soaked fabric of her cardigan clinging uncomfortably to her arms, her fingers numb as they hovered over the ruined keyboard. Every keystroke she tried to make produced only short, broken sparks on the cracked screen, like the remnants of a dream too fragile to survive this world. She wiped her trembling hands against her skirt under the desk, trying to make herself smaller, less visible, wishing she could simply disappear into the bland, gray cubicle walls. But invisibility was not granted today. Whispers fluttered through the room like poisoned feathers, brushing against her ears, each word sharper than the last. Maybe she should go back to wherever she came from. Vanessa Chu sneered under her breath, just loud enough for nearby desks to hear. Blake Turner snorted, tapping the Rolex on his wrist with exaggerated disdain, murmuring, surprised she can even afford the subway fare. Laughter, low and cutting, slithered through the air, unseen but unmistakably lethal. Sabrina Lewis leaned against the printer station, casually flipping through a glossy finance magazine, her bright red nails tapping against the counter, each tap a cruel metronome marking the rhythm of Amara's silent disintegration. The wounds they inflicted were not physical, but they were just as real, just as bleeding. 1,000 tiny cuts, slicing through dignity, through self-worth, invisible to the untrained eye, yet devastating in their cumulative weight. Every time Amara lifted her head, she met cold, empty stares that flicked away as if looking at her too long would be contagious. Every soft laugh that erupted across the office after she passed by pierced her like a dagger she wasn't supposed to acknowledge. Every accidental bump, every misplaced file, every overly loud comment about designer brands or luxury vacations was another stone in the wall they built around her, trapping her inside a cage of silent mockery. And the cruelest part, the part that wrapped around her heart like iron chains, was that no one, not a single soul, thought to question it. Not the senior analysts, not the interns, not even Richard Hale, who sat perched in his office throne, turning a blind eye with the practiced indifference of a man who believed suffering was simply the price of ambition. Amara lowered her gaze, focusing on a single droplet of caramel coffee slowly sliding down the side of her damaged laptop. One droplet, heavy, trembling, relentless just like her. She clenched her jaw, feeling the familiar burn behind her eyes, and blinked it away with the steel-hard discipline only those who had grown up learning to swallow pain could understand. Somewhere deep within her, buried beneath the humiliation, beneath the ache, a voice whispered, "Not yet. Not now, they haven't won. Not if you don't let them." The office lights above buzzed faintly, the clock hands dragged forward, and Amara Johnson, battered but unbowed, straightened her back once more. Her story was still being written, and they, in their arrogance, had just made the mistake of thinking they could write its ending for her. The days that followed blurred into a haze of cold glares and sharper whispers, each one chipping a little more away from the fragile armor Amara had built around herself. She arrived early each morning, clutching her old tote bag like a talisman, and left late each night, moving through the gleaming halls of Titan Financial like a ghost no one cared to see. Yet underneath the surface of routine, something darker was festering. The atmosphere shifted, almost imperceptibly at first, a snicker that lingered too long, a group of heads that leaned closer together when she passed, a sudden hush that sliced the air when her name was spoken. Amara felt it in her bones, a cold certainty curling at the edges of her instincts. Honed by years of surviving places where survival was never guaranteed, something was coming. She just didn't know what yet. In the employee lounge, beyond the reach of prying supervisors, Sabrina Lewis huddled with Blake Turner and Vanessa Chu, their heads bowed together over their phones, their voices low but dripping with malicious glee. "It's not enough to ignore her," Sabrina whispered, her green eyes gleaming with a vicious light. "We need to teach her a lesson. A warning." "Yeah," Blake chuckled, drumming his fingers against the countertop. "Turn her into a joke. Viral. Make her wish she never set foot here." Vanessa, her phone already poised, grinned wickedly. "We record it, edit it, post it everywhere. She'll never work in finance again." Their laughter, low and poisonous, slithered through the vents and walls of the Titan building like venom in the blood of a dying beast. They plotted not just to humiliate Amara, but to erase her, to turn her existence into nothing more than a punchline shared over coffee breaks and drunken happy hours. It wasn't enough that she was different. It wasn't enough that she didn't belong to their glossy, manufactured world. She had dared to survive, and for that, they would punish her. Meanwhile, Richard Hale, whose duty was to uphold dignity and respect within these walls, watched from his glass office without intervening, a complicit king presiding over his crumbling court. He saw the looks, heard the stifled giggles, noticed the sudden disappearances of key documents from Amara's desk, the mysteriously accidental coffee spills that stained her reports. But he did nothing, because in his mind, Amara Johnson with her simple clothes, her quiet strength, her refusal to play their shallow games was expendable. She was a glitch in the polished system he had crafted, and soon, if left alone, the system would correct itself. Amara, unaware of the full scale of the conspiracy, but feeling the walls close in tighter each day, clung to her work like a lifeline. She pored over spreadsheets, triple-checked her reports, and stayed late polishing data presentations that would never be acknowledged. She fought not just to keep her job, but to keep her sense of self intact. But no amount of hard work, no amount of humility could shield her from the storm they were conjuring, a storm meticulously designed to tear her apart piece by piece, until there was nothing left but the bitter laughter of those who believed cruelty was just another tool for survival. And somewhere, deep inside her, that same small ember of defiance, the one they thought they had extinguished, burned hotter with every cruel whisper that drifted her way. They thought they were weaving her downfall. But in their arrogance, they failed to see they were weaving the noose that would one day hang them. Friday afternoon arrived with an eerie stillness that cloaked the 42nd floor of Titan Financial Group. The usual hum of keyboards and the low murmur of conference calls seemed muted, almost expectant, as if the entire office was holding its breath. Amara Johnson, seated at her corner desk, hunched over her laptop, trying to lose herself in the familiar comfort of numbers and clean, logical data. But she could feel it the way conversations halted when she entered a room, the way glances skittered away, only to double back when she wasn't looking, the way whispers slithered behind her like cold, invisible hands. The storm she had felt brewing all week was about to break. She just didn't know how brutal it would be. At precisely 3:57 p.m., Sabrina Lewis rose from her desk, the heels of her crimson Louboutins tapping sharply against the marble floor like the ticking of a final countdown. She sauntered toward Amara, carrying a thick, disorganized stack of reports pressed tight against her chest. Her mouth twisted into a smile so sweet it reeked of poison. Behind her, Blake Turner leaned casually against a cubicle, arms crossed, his smirk wide and cruel. Vanessa Chu hovered near the break room door, her phone already lifted, camera lens trained and ready, her finger trembling with barely contained excitement over the show about to unfold. Amara lifted her head just as Sabrina reached her desk. There was no warning, no request, no greeting. With a calculated flick of her wrist, Sabrina slammed the heavy stack of outdated, dog-eared documents onto Amara's workspace. The impact sent papers flying across the surface and knocked over Amara's half-full water cup, soaking what little dignity the ruined desk still held. The slap of the papers hitting the desk echoed unnaturally loud through the expectant silence of the floor. Amara stared at the mess for a heartbeat, her chest tightening painfully. Sabrina's voice cut through the air like a blade, dripping with faux sweetness. "Here you go, Amara," she said brightly, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Since you seem a little underworked, I thought you'd appreciate something productive to do." A titter of laughter broke out from a nearby desk. Blake snorted loudly while Vanessa adjusted her phone to capture Amara's reaction from a better angle. Every pair of eyes seemed to snap toward her, waiting, hungry, waiting for her to break. For a moment, the world slowed, as if giving Amara a choice, to crumble under the weight of their cruelty, or to rise, bruised but unbroken. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the desk. She lifted her chin slightly, her voice calm but unyielding, slicing through the room like a sudden gust of winter air. "I have a deadline to meet. These documents are not part of my assigned work," she said, her tone neither apologetic nor defiant. Simply factual. Sabrina's smile faltered for a split second, her eyes narrowing into green slits. Blake barked a mocking laugh, clapping his hands slowly as if watching a particularly entertaining clown performance. "Oh, look at her," he jeered, getting all high and mighty. "Bet she's polishing that resume for Dollar Tree already." Vanessa giggled behind her phone, shifting closer, zooming in shamelessly on Amara's face, her soaked cardigan, her tired but steady eyes. The screen's reflection briefly caught in Amara's gaze. She saw herself there, distorted and small through the lens of someone else's cruelty. Around them, the office buzzed with barely contained glee. Even the ones who didn't join the laughter watched in complicit silence, the way spectators watch a gladiator fall in an arena, pretending that simply observing absolves them of guilt. Amara inhaled slowly, willing her face into impassivity. She knew the moment she cried, snapped, or stormed away would be the moment they would declare victory, and she would not give them that. Not today. Not ever. Inside her, beneath the bruised dignity and the pooling grief, something solidified, a resolve sharp enough to cut through the suffocating air. She straightened her spine, lifted the scattered papers carefully, and without a word, placed them back into a neat stack, ignoring the sticky wetness of the spilled water soaking into the corners. The act, small and quiet, was an act of rebellion, of survival. Across the room, Richard Hale stood at the door of his glass office, arms folded, a cold smile tugging at his lips, like a king watching a sacrificial lamb bleed for the entertainment of the court. But none of them, not even Richard, realized that this moment, which they thought would crush Amara beyond repair, would instead become the crack through which a devastating storm would soon come pouring in, a storm they themselves had summoned without even knowing it. The false laughter that rippled through the open office space eventually faded into a heavy, expectant silence. Amara sat still, her hands methodically smoothing the battered, water-stained stack of documents, her heart pounding a slow, painful rhythm against her ribs. She could feel the eyes still burning into her back, hungry for her to break, desperate to see her crack wide open and confirm every vicious stereotype they carried in their shallow hearts. But Amara would not give them that. She would not gift them her tears, just as she tucked the last of the ruined papers neatly back onto the desk. The sharp, deliberate click of dress shoes against marble floors echoed across the floor. She knew that sound instantly. It had been seared into her memory like the ticking of a clock in a prison cell. Richard Hale, the regional manager, the man who wore his authority like a crown and viewed Amara's existence not as a testament to perseverance, but as a blemish on his pristine kingdom. He approached slowly, savoring the tension he had helped cultivate, his perfectly pressed blue suit and silver tie gleaming under the fluorescent lights. The conversations in the office died completely now. Only the faint buzzing of the overhead lights and the shallow breathing of dozens of spectators filled the space. Richard stopped at Amara's desk, looming over her like a judge ready to pronounce a sentence already decided. His lips curled into a stiff, professional smile, the kind of smile reserved for condolences at funerals or formal warnings. "Amara," he said, voice smooth as glass, cutting like a blade beneath its civility. "It seems like today's been a little overwhelming for you." His words dripped with feigned concern, a wolf's teeth hidden beneath velvet. "Maybe," he continued, pausing just long enough for every ear in the office to strain closer, "you should take the rest of the day to compose yourself, gather your thoughts, regain composure." The message was crystal clear. Leave. Disappear. Don't make a scene that might taint the spotless illusion of Titan Financial's inclusive culture. Amara raised her eyes to meet his, her gaze steady, refusing to shrink even as humiliation coiled like a serpent around her chest. But Richard wasn't done. With a deliberate flourish, he reached into the breast pocket of his suit and pulled out a pale yellow sticky note. He didn't hand it to her with dignity. He simply let it flutter down like a piece of discarded trash onto her desk, the adhesive corner sticking weakly to the wet surface. 4 words, scrawled in neat, decisive handwriting. "Clean up your act." The weight of those words slammed into Amara harder than any slap, harder than any shove or insult. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a verdict, a declaration that she was unwanted, unworthy, and unredeemable. A collective judgment passed down by a jury of cowards hiding behind smiles and silence. Across the room, Sabrina smirked openly. Blake elbowed Vanessa, who barely stifled a giggle as she pretended to scroll through her phone, the camera still slyly capturing every humiliating second. Amara's fingers trembled slightly as she reached out and plucked the sticky note from the desk. She turned it over slowly, as if by some miracle the back might contain a different message, something less cruel, but there was nothing. Just the bare-faced disdain of a man who saw her existence as a mistake to be erased. For a moment, just a moment, her vision blurred at the edges, the pressure behind her eyes threatening to spill over. But she inhaled deeply, clutching the note tightly in her palm until the corners bit into her skin. She would not cry. She would not rage. She would not give them what they so desperately craved. In the distance, the great clock above the reception desk ticked forward, its mechanical hands indifferent to the small cruelties unfolding below. Time moved forward, and so would she. Without a word, Amara stood. Her chair gave a soft creak of protest as it shifted behind her. She gathered her soaked tote bag, her battered laptop, and the remnants of her ruined reports. Her dignity, though bruised and bleeding, was still hers to carry. As she moved across the floor toward the break room, dozens of eyes followed, some mocking, some guilty, most simply blank, but none brave enough to meet her gaze. And in that hollow, polished world of fake smiles and gleaming surfaces, a storm began to rumble quietly in Amara Johnson's heart, a storm that would soon tear everything they built apart. The door to the employee break room swung shut behind Amara with a muted, final click, sealing her away from the venomous stares and the brittle, mocking silence of the office outside. She stood there for a moment, leaning heavily against the door, her breath catching painfully in her throat. The harsh fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a cold, sterile glow over the cramped room with its plastic chairs and cheap counter. Against the wall, a cracked mirror above the sink reflected her image back at her. A soaked, battered figure draped in a coffee-stained cardigan, her natural curls frizzed and wild, her brown eyes rimmed with the crimson strain of unshed tears. She barely recognized herself. Her knees buckled slightly, and she stumbled toward the counter, clutching the edge as if the earth itself had shifted beneath her feet. And then, when she could no longer hold it inside, the tears came not in loud sobs or wild gasps, but in silent, searing rivers that carved paths down her cheeks. She let her forehead fall against the cool cabinet door, her body shaking with the force of her heartbreak, her humiliation, her exhaustion. For so long, she had held it all in, locked the pain away in the fragile vault of her chest, convinced that endurance would be enough, that silent strength would somehow shield her. But today had shattered that illusion. Today, they had broken something sacred inside her. With trembling fingers, Amara fumbled in the pocket of her sodden tote bag, pulling out her old, battered phone. The screen lit up weakly, the cracks along the edges catching the fluorescent light like spiderwebs spun from sorrow. She stared at it for a moment, her thumb hovering over a single contact name. Ethan Johnson, her husband, her anchor, the only person in the world who saw her, not as a nuisance or a mistake, but as something precious, something powerful. Amara hesitated, guilt gnawing at the edges of her resolve. She had worked so hard to keep this part of her life separate from him, to shield him from the ugliness she endured daily. He was busy building empires, negotiating deals that shifted the balance of industries, and she had wanted, more than anything, to prove she could stand on her own. But today was too much. Today, she couldn't carry the burden alone anymore. With a shuddering breath, she pressed the call button. The line barely rang twice before it connected. Ray, his voice, deep and warm, flooded through the phone like sunlight cutting through a storm. "Are you all right?" Those simple words, spoken with such raw concern, shattered what little composure Amara had left. She pressed a hand to her mouth to muffle the sob that escaped, her knees finally giving out as she slid down against the counter to the floor. "I'm not okay, Nate," she whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of her pain. It's been bad. So bad today." For a heartbeat. There was silence on the other end. A silence that wasn't hesitation, but calculation, swift, deadly, protective. When Ethan spoke again, his tone had changed completely. It was no longer soft and tender. It was cold steel wrapped in velvet. "Where are you?" he demanded quietly. "Titan Financial, 6th floor, break room." Amara managed to choke out. "Stay right there," Ethan said, his voice brooking no argument. "Don't move. I'm coming." Before she could even attempt a protest, the line went dead. Amara stared at the phone clutched in her trembling hand, the quiet finality of the ended call thudding against her chest like a drumbeat of hope. She let the phone fall gently into her lap and closed her eyes. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to believe, truly, believe that she didn't have to fight alone anymore. Help was coming, not in the form of pity, not with more empty words, but with the righteous fury of someone who loved her more than pride, more than appearances, more than anything. And even though her body was broken and her spirit bruised, a small, fierce smile curled at the corner of Amara's lips as she lifted her head, wiped her tears with the back of her sleeve, and waited. Ethan Johnson was on his way, and the reckoning they had unknowingly summoned with their cruelty was about to arrive. The minutes that followed stretched into an eternity. Amara sat motionless on the cold, tiled floor of the break room, her knees tucked against her chest, her mind a fragile battlefield between lingering fear and the slow, steady rising of something stronger, hope. Beyond the closed door, she could hear the office returning to its hollow rhythm, laughter rippling faintly through the halls, the mechanical tapping of keyboards, the occasional ring of a distant phone. To them, the show was over. The prey had been sufficiently wounded. The wolves had moved on, satisfied. They had no idea. Somewhere down the hallway, the low chime of an elevator arriving echoed like the distant toll of a funeral bell. At first, no one paid it any mind. Elevators dinged all day in a building like Titan Financial Group. But then came the heavy, deliberate footsteps, sharp, measured, each one landing with the force of inevitability. The sound grew louder, more distinct, a rhythm of coming judgment that seemed to shake the marble beneath their feet. Conversations stuttered, the tapping of keyboards faltered. Heads turned toward the entrance. And then he appeared, Ethan Johnson. He stepped into the main lobby of the 42nd floor like a force of nature compressed into human form, clad in a perfectly tailored dark gray suit that seemed to absorb the light around him. His presence was a living contradiction, silent, yet thunderous, calm, yet devastating. His black hair was immaculately styled, his jaw tight, his eyes sharp. Cold, predatory scanned the room with a precision that made breathing feel like an offense. He needed no introduction. Even those who had never met him recognized him instantly. Ethan Johnson, the elusive billionaire, CEO of Johnson Holdings, a name whispered in boardrooms with reverence and fear. A man whose nod could open empires or crush them into dust. A ripple of pure terror swept across the floor. Coffee cups trembled in trembling hands. Conversations died mid-sentence. Sabrina Lewis, halfway through mocking Amara's meltdown, froze with her mouth half open, the words turning to ash on her tongue. Blake Turner stiffened so sharply he nearly knocked over his chair. Vanessa Chu, phone still in hand, instinctively lowered it, her palms suddenly slick with sweat. Even Richard Hale, from the glassed-in safety of his corner office, stepped forward, his confident smirk slipping into something brittle and pale. Ethan didn't glance at them. He didn't need to. With single-minded focus, he strode across the gleaming floor, cutting through the stunned office like a scalpel through diseased flesh. Heading straight for the break room. For Amara, every step he took seemed to drain the oxygen from the room. Employees flattened themselves against cubicles to get out of his way. Some simply stood frozen, unable to move, unable to comprehend how the fragile narrative they had constructed was unraveling before their very eyes. Ethan reached the door and pushed it open without hesitation. There, huddled against the far wall, framed by the stark fluorescent light, sat Amara, his wife, his entire world. For a fraction of a second, the icy mask he wore cracked, just enough for warmth to flood his gaze as he looked at her, battered but unbowed, broken but still fighting. His voice, when he spoke, was low, steady, and carried an authority that dared anyone to challenge him. Ready to go. Love, Amara lifted her head, her eyes locking with his, and for the first time all day, she allowed herself to truly breathe. She nodded, rising slowly to her feet, gathering her ruined tote bag and battered laptop with quiet dignity. No panic, no shame, only strength. Ethan reached out, offering his hand, a simple, unspoken promise written in the gesture. You are not alone. You have never been alone. And as Amara placed her hand in his, a collective, horrified realization rippled through the office like an electric shock. Rachel Johnson, the woman they had humiliated, laughed at, and dismissed as unworthy, was not some nameless outsider. She was the wife of the man who held the future of Titan Financial Group in the palm of his hand. Panic sparked behind polished smiles. Faces turned ghostly pale. Even the walls themselves seemed to shrink inward under the weight of the catastrophic mistake that had been made. But Ethan Johnson didn't spare them a glance. He didn't need to scream. He didn't need to rage. His presence alone declared what was about to come with terrifying clarity. Without a word, he turned with Amara beside him and began walking slowly, deliberately, back through the frozen crowd. And in that devastating silence, as the doors to the elevator slid open to receive them, everyone understood. The storm had arrived, and it would spare no one. The soft chime of the elevator behind them faded into silence as Ethan and Amara turned back to face the office floor, not because they had to, but because Ethan had no intention of letting the storm pass quietly. His hand remained firmly wrapped around Amara's, his thumb tracing slow, deliberate circles against her skin, a silent reminder that she was safe now, that she would never again face these wolves alone. Ethan scanned the stunned, paling faces before him, his dark eyes colder than the January wind whipping down Fifth Avenue, for a long, agonizing heartbeat. No one moved. No one breathed. And then, in a voice sharp and surgical, Ethan spoke. Who, he asked softly, dangerously, has been mistreating my wife? His words didn't boom or roar, they sliced. Precise and devastating, every eye in the office flickered wildly, searching for an escape that no longer existed. Sabrina Lewis, normally poised and dripping with false charm, visibly blanched, clutching her designer bag like a child clutches a broken toy. Blake Turner shifted from foot to foot, his usual cocky posture collapsing into a nervous, slumped mess. Vanessa Chu shrank behind her cubicle wall, her phone slipping from her hand to the carpet with a muffled thud. Even Richard Hale, master of polite cruelty, faltered, the smug assurance draining from his face. No one answered. Of course they didn't. Cowards never do when the curtain falls. Ethan's gaze sharpened, zeroing in on Sabrina. He took a single step forward, and the room seemed to flinch collectively. You, he said, voice still maddeningly calm, started this. Sabrina opened her mouth, but whatever carefully crafted excuse she had prepared died on her tongue under the weight of his stare. Her hands trembled, the blood draining from her perfectly made-up face, humiliating her, mocking her, throwing drinks at her like she's less than human. Ethan continued, his words clipped and merciless. He turned to Blake without missing a beat. And you, he said coldly, assaulting her, recording her humiliation, laughing like it was entertainment. Blake looked ready to bolt, but his legs seemed frozen to the spot. The silence grew thick, suffocating. No one dared move. No one dared speak. Vanessa Chu, Ethan said, his tone slicing through the heavy air like a scalpel through silk. Filming and broadcasting it, an act of bullying so brazen it could bankrupt companies if tied to Titan's name. Vanessa whimpered softly, her face ghost white, her hands wringing each other uselessly at her sides. Finally, Ethan turned his attention to the last figure, standing stiff and pale behind his glass office door. "And you, Richard Hale," he said, his voice now dipped in something far colder than anger, contempt. "You, who were paid not just to manage, but to protect every employee under your watch, stood by and allowed this cesspool to thrive, encouraged it, fostered it. You built your petty empire on the broken backs of those you deemed unworthy." A deep, shuddering silence blanketed the room. Some employees who had remained silent out of fear or convenience now shifted uneasily, guilt gnawing visibly at their faces. Others lowered their gazes, knowing that their cowardice had finally been dragged into the unforgiving light. Ethan's gaze swept over the entire room, his next words measured and lethal. "You judged her by her clothes, by her skin, by the fact that she dared to be better without needing to wear your gilded chains. You mistook humility for weakness, simplicity for inferiority." He paused, letting the damning truth settle deep into the marrow of everyone present. "But you," Ethan said, voice dropping low enough to make even the walls seem to lean closer, "you have made the gravest mistake of all." He turned slightly, allowing his gaze to fall lovingly, protectively, on Amara. "You attack someone who is infinitely stronger, smarter, and more worthy than any of you could ever hope to be." Sabrina's lips quivered, trying desperately to summon a defense, but no words came. Blake stared at the floor, as if hoping it would swallow him whole. Vanessa clutched the edge of her desk until her knuckles turned white. Richard's mouth opened slightly, perhaps to protest, perhaps to beg, but Ethan's next words sealed their fates before he could draw another breath. "Today, there will be consequences," Ethan said quietly, almost tenderly, and in that moment, the weight of their sins, so long hidden beneath polished smiles and expensive suits, came crashing down with a force none of them could withstand. The silence that blanketed Titan Financial Group was no longer just heavy, it was suffocating, a tangible force pressing down on every trembling figure who had once laughed at Amara Johnson's pain. Ethan stood unmoving at the center of the room, his very presence enough to hold dozens of so-called professionals in complete, paralyzed dread. And then, in a voice that carried the finality of a gavel striking wood, he delivered the sentence, effective immediately. Ethan said, his tone sharp and unyielding, "Sabrina Lewis, Blake Turner, Vanessa Chu, and Richard Hale, you are all terminated." The words fell into the stunned office like stones dropped into still water, sending ripples of horror outward. Sabrina gasped audibly, her manicured hand flying to her mouth, as if she could physically catch the reality from spilling in. Blake stumbled backward, knocking over a stack of client folders, the papers fluttering to the floor in a pitiful, frantic mess. Vanessa made a strangled sound in the back of her throat, her carefully curated Instagram-ready facade crumbling as tears welled in her heavily mascaraed eyes. Richard Hale, the once unshakable manager who had reigned over his domain with silent cruelty, looked as if the ground itself had shifted beneath him. His lips moved, forming desperate, broken words. "Mrs. Johnson, please," Richard croaked, his voice barely recognizable, stripped of authority, of dignity. "Let's discuss this. It was a misunderstanding. They were joking. We never intended." Ethan raised a single hand, a gesture of effortless command that halted Richard's pathetic scrambling mid-sentence. "You misunderstand your position," Ethan said, his voice as cold and merciless as a glacier. "This isn't a negotiation. It's a reckoning." Sabrina took a shaky step forward, her heels clicking on the marble like the frantic tapping of a trapped animal. "Mr. Johnson, too, can apologize. To her," she stammered, pointing weakly at Amara without daring to meet her eyes. "We didn't know. If we had known who she was," Ethan's glare turned lethal, silencing her instantly. "And that's the problem," he said, voice low. "Deadly. You think respect must be earned by status. That human decency is only owed to those you fear. That kindness is currency to be traded, not the minimum standard of humanity." His words hit harder than any shouted accusation could have. The employees around them, even those who had not directly participated in the cruelty, but had watched and said nothing, now lowered their heads in shame. Ethan wasn't merely firing a handful of culprits. He was exposing the rotting soul of a culture that had festered unchecked. Vanessa clutched her phone against her chest as if it could shield her, her whispers breaking into desperate sobs. Blake rubbed his hands over his face, leaving slick trails of sweat. Richard, the once proud manager, sagged visibly, his shoulders drooping under the weight of his own cowardice. And Ethan, without raising his voice, without stepping back, continued relentlessly, "You will not work here. You will not use the names of Titan Financial, Johnson Holdings, or any company I have even the slightest influence over, ever again. Your actions have been documented. Your behavior will follow you wherever you go." Sabrina whimpered something unintelligible, her designer image disintegrating before everyone's eyes. Vanessa's shoulders shook with silent sobs. Blake's hands trembled uncontrollably. Richard stared blankly, as if watching the death of the career he had spent decades building. Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out a small device. Tapping the screen once, almost instantly, 2 uniformed security guards entered the floor from the elevator lobby. Their presence silent but absolute. Without needing instruction, they moved towards Sabrina, Blake, Vanessa, and Richard, their polite but firm posture making it clear they were no longer welcome here. As Sabrina tried to protest, she tried to cling to her desk like a shipwrecked sailor clinging to driftwood. The guards gently but inexorably guided her toward the exit. Blake followed, slumped and beaten. Vanessa wept openly now, her tears streaking black trails down her cheeks. Richard Hale, the proud regional manager, the man who had turned his eyes away from cruelty day after day, shuffled forward like a ghost of his former self. Head bowed, hands trembling. Not a single colleague moved to help them. Not a single hand was extended. The office, once filled with smug laughter and whispered mockery, now stood in reverent, devastated silence. And through it all, Amara stood quietly by Ethan's side, not gloating, not smirking, simply existing in a dignity so profound it made every sneer, every insult thrown at her seem all the more pathetic in retrospect. As the 4 disgraced figures disappeared into the elevator under the watchful eyes of security, Ethan turned once more to the room. His words, spoken calmly and clearly, sealed the lesson into their bones. "Remember this day," he said, voice low and resonant, "not because of who was punished, but because of what you allowed to happen. Silence is complicity, cowardice is guilt, and cruelty, no matter how small, has a price." He offered his arm to Amara, and she took it, lifting her chin, her presence radiating a quiet, unshakable power. Together, without looking back, they walked toward the elevators, leaving behind a room full of ghosts, the remnants of those who thought they could humiliate someone and face no consequence. But consequences had come, and justice had been served. As the elevator doors slid closed behind Sabrina, Blake, Vanessa, and Richard, a profound and terrible silence settled over the 42nd floor of Titan Financial Group. It was not the silence of reverence, nor of mourning. It was the suffocating, hollow vacuum left behind when a kingdom built on cruelty finally collapses in on itself. Employees who had once smirked, whispered, and giggled now sat frozen at their desks, unable to meet one another's eyes. Some stared blankly at their computer screens, pretending to work, pretending they hadn't been witnesses. Bystanders, cowards, others hunched over their keyboards, shoulders curled inward as if trying to make themselves invisible, hoping the judgment that had fallen upon their colleagues would not reach them. But it already had. It clung to the air like smoke after a fire, acrid, undeniable, inescapable. The polished marble floors that once gleamed with pride now seemed cold and sterile, a monument to everything rotten that had been allowed to fester here. The glass walls, once symbols of transparency and ambition, now looked brittle and cracked, unable to hide the ugly truths that had been laid bare. And in the center of it all stood Amara Johnson. She did not gloat. She did not smile with vindication. She simply existed tall, quiet, unbroken, a living testament to a dignity that none of their cruelty could destroy. Every step she took across that marble floor was a quiet thunderclap. Every lift of her chin, every steady breath she drew, was a declaration of victory not just over them, but over the small, gnawing doubts that had once tried to poison her spirit. She carried no designer bag, wore no label flashing her worth, and yet she shone brighter than anyone in that entire building ever had. Ethan Johnson remained by her side, but he did not shield her. He did not need to. The world could finally see that Amara Johnson did not need saving. She had already saved herself. As they moved slowly toward the main lobby, a few employees shifted awkwardly in their seats. A young intern, cheeks flushed with shame, tried to mumble a greeting, but the words died halfway. One of the senior associates, who had often laughed along with Blake and Sabrina, rose halfway from his chair, only to sit down again when Amara's steady gaze swept across him, not with anger, but with a deep, that impenetrable calm that made his excuses shrivel on his tongue. No one dared follow them. No one dared speak. They simply watched, small, broken, and silent as Amara Johnson, the woman they had tried so hard to crush, walked through the ruins of their shallow kingdom with her head held high. The elevator dinged softly again as it arrived for them. Ethan pressed the button and held the door open, but it was Amara who took the final step forward, leading the way. As the door slid closed, cutting her off from the toxic world she was leaving behind, Amara allowed herself a small, private smile, not one of triumph, not of bitterness, but of peace. She had survived. She had endured, and now she was free. Above them, etched into the glass wall near the reception area, were the Titan Financial Group's company values: integrity, excellence, respect. Words that had long since lost their meaning here, but words that, ironically, Amara had embodied more truly than any of them ever would. And with the final chime of the elevator descending, she left them behind, taking with her nothing but her dignity, her strength, and the quiet, invincible knowledge that real worth could never, ever be bought or broken. The elevator descended smoothly, the soft hum of its machinery a soothing contrast to the chaos left behind. Amara Johnson stood quietly beside Ethan, their hands still clasped, their silence filled not with grief, but with something far more powerful: liberation. As the numbers above the elevator door ticked downward, 38, 30, 22, Amara allowed herself a moment to truly feel it, the freedom seeping into her bones, the weight peeling away from her shoulders, piece by broken piece. She wasn't just leaving a company. She was leaving behind a prison built of whispered slanders, silent indifference, and polished cruelty. She was stepping out of a cage she had been too proud to admit had ever trapped her. When the elevator chimed and the doors slid open onto the bustling lobby of Titan Financial's ground floor, the contrast was almost overwhelming. Sunlight streamed through the vast glass facade, gilding the polished floors and illuminating the marble pillars. The world outside moved with life, fast, chaotic, beautiful in its indifference. For a moment, Amara hesitated, not from fear, not from regret, but from awe, because for the first time in what felt like forever, the future stretched before her, unwritten, untamed, waiting. Ethan glanced at her, a small, proud smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. He said nothing. He didn't need to. His faith in her was absolute, radiating from him like warmth from a sun she had almost forgotten existed. Amara squeezed his hand once, firmly, and stepped forward. Together, they crossed the gleaming marble lobby, the noise of the city beyond growing louder with every step, promising 1,000 possibilities. They passed by sleek businessmen, tapping frantically at their phones, tourists snapping photos of the soaring lobby, young interns rushing in with nervous excitement, but no one stopped them. No one could touch them anymore. As they approached the towering glass doors leading to the street, Amara let go of Ethan's hand and placed her palm against the cool metal bar. She paused for just a breath, not looking back because there was nothing left worth seeing behind her. She pushed the door open. The city greeted her with open arms. The sun struck her face, first warm, unfiltered, real, followed by the sound of taxi horns, snippets of street musicians playing jazz on the corner, the scent of roasted peanuts drifting from a vendor nearby. Life, vibrant, messy, uncontrollable life. Amara stepped onto the sidewalk, lifting her face toward the endless blue sky above the skyscrapers, letting the sunlight kiss her skin. She closed her eyes and breathed deeply, filling her lungs with freedom. In that moment, she wasn't the woman they tried to humiliate. She wasn't the victim they had mocked. She wasn't even just Ethan's wife. She was herself, entire, unbroken, uncontainable. A woman who had endured the worst humanity could offer, and had walked away not with hatred, not with bitterness, but with her soul intact and her head held high. Ethan stepped beside her, and without a word, they began to walk, their steps slow but sure, weaving into the vibrant pulse of the city, becoming part of something infinitely bigger, infinitely freer than any glass tower could ever contain. And somewhere behind them, high above in a crumbling office built on arrogance and neglect, the memory of Amara Johnson would linger not as a warning, not as a failure, but as a legend, proof that true strength doesn't come from titles or tailored suits or golden nameplates. It comes from surviving, from enduring, from standing tall in the storm until the sun rises again. And as Amara disappeared into the sea of humanity, The simple black woman they had once tried to erase became something untouchable, a testament to dignity, to resilience, to the unbreakable fire of a soul that refused to be conquered. Amara Johnson's victory wasn't won with revenge. It wasn't celebrated with shouting or applause. It was carried quietly, powerfully, in the way she walked away with dignity intact. Spirit unbroken, and heart ablaze with a strength they could never touch. This isn't just her story. It's the story of every soul who has been judged by appearances, of every quiet warrior who chose kindness over cruelty, of every heart that refused to break when the world turned its back. What about you? Have you ever stood alone, only to realize you were stronger than you ever knew? Share your story in the comments. Like, subscribe, and join us, because here we honor the warriors who fight with dignity.